All right, it is now 1 o'clock, so we will go ahead and begin. If I could just get everybody to mute their screens right now so that there's no interference during the presentation. And we'll begin. So hello, everybody. My name is Hale, and I want to welcome everyone to our session today, A Century of American Drug Use, Psychoactive Drugs Among Native Americans, Hippies, and the Working Poor. This is part of the American Historical Association's virtual colloquium series, and we would like to thank the AHA, especially Victor Medina del Toro, who has had twice a year putting this all together for us in the midst of the pandemic. Also, thank you to Greg Bond of the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy for promoting today's session via Point, the joint blog of the Alcohol and Drugs History Society and the American Institute of Pharmacy. And a major thank you to everyone in here with us today. A couple more logistical things to cover before we start the session. Again, please mute your microphones. Also, this session does have closed captions available if you would like to use the feature. There should be a bottom of the screen that says live transcript. Just click that to enable it. And also, please use the chat to post any questions. As the other panelists are presenting, I'll write your questions down and we'll get to all of them at the end of the entire session. And lastly, this session is being recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube. If you are interested in receiving the link or a copy of any of our papers, or you just want to connect with us, we will share our contact information at the end of the session as well. Also, we have all of your emails, so we will email you once here in a couple of days once the session does get uploaded to YouTube. So, inherent to discussing drug use, there may be times where it seems that we are condoning or condemning usage, but this is not the case. We are strictly telling the history of the substances from each of our respected eras and through our own historiographic lens. The history of drugs and drug use is a relatively new and understudied field, largely because of the taboo of the subject. So statistics show that just as many people have used drugs to vote in presidential elections, yet electoral histories are more common and accepted research fields. Our panel today brings together scholars with research focuses on a variety of drugs, periods, and groups who are collectively presenting analyses of drug use from the early 19th century through the 1960s. Now for our speakers, I'll introduce us in the order in which we are presenting. It's going to go in chronological order. First is going to be Lila Teeters, who is a Charlotte W. Newcomb Fellow with the Institute for Citizen Scholars. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Vassar College and received her master's degree from the Teachers College at Columbia University. She just completed her PhD at the University of New Hampshire. Congratulations again, Lila.
Thank you.
And her dissertation is entitled Native Citizens, the Fight for and Against Native American Citizenship in the United States. Next will be Bob Beat, cultural historian interested in the culture of cannabis in the United States before the 1960s. He's written on cannabis history and folklore, drug war activism, and cannabis legalization in New York. He is a doctoral candidate at in the history department at SUNY Albany, an adjunct at Utica, and a contributing editor for Point. Next will be John Moretta, who specializes in 19th and 20th century U.S. history and has published several monographs, textbooks, and journal articles. He also wrote the wonderful and nearly definitive history of the hippie counterculture titled The Hippies. Dr. Moretta has been a history professor at Houston Community College for nearly 40 years and has also taught upper-level U.S. history courses at the University of Houston since 1986. And then last to present will be myself. Again, my name is Hale. I'm a historian of the 60s counterculture with a focus on the hippie communities of Atlanta and Florida. I earned my BS in history education from Kennesaw State University, and I received my MA in history from Georgia State University in August of last year. I've worked at several museums and archives, and I currently work at the Charles Schweitzer Library in Marietta, Georgia. So without further ado, Dr. Teeters, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cole, and thank you everyone for being here. It's really my pleasure. And thank you to my fellow panelists as well. Before I begin, I just want to start with a land acknowledgement. So I'm coming to you from Exeter, New Hampshire, and I want to recognize that as the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, the Pennacook, and the Wabanaki peoples. And I just want to express that I acknowledge and honor their stewardship of the land, past and present. And with that, I will share my screen with you. And can I get a thumbs up that that's working? Excellent, great. Okay, so in full disclosure, I'm not a historian of drug use in America. I'm a historian of US citizenship policy and Native American histories in the modern era. So I'm really looking forward to getting feedback today as to how I can sharpen my work, particularly within history of drug use in America. As Cole said, my manuscript is entitled Native Citizens, the Fight for and Against Citizenship in the United States. And it focuses on the critical period between the 1887 Dawes Act and the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the tenets of Native American citizenship, I'm going to give you a brief primer on those in the form of pictures. So the first one that I have is from 1917, which shows Santee individuals becoming citizens of the United States. They are participating in what was an elaborate citizenship ritual, which marked Native American secular baptism into formal American civic belonging. In 1887, Congress had passed the Dawes Act, which, among many other things, made it possible for Native Americans to apply for citizenship in the United States. And this is, of course, in addition to its infamous allotment provisions. In order to become a citizen, Native Americans had to prove their quote unquote competency, which meant adopting the habits of civilized life. And that was left vague, but it was very much in line with the assimilationist program that the United States was engaging in. And you can really see that in the citizenship ceremony that you're looking at right here. So we have Moses Red Owl, who was a Santee individual. He was handed a bow by the Indian inspector. His name was James McLaughlin, and he was asked to shoot that arrow afield. After he did, the inspector would say, "You have shot your last arrow. You are now a citizen of the United States." And then this individual would have to take a pledge to the president of the United States and put his or her hand on a plow, which you can see a picture of here, which was meant to replace the arrow. And that would mark sort of their adoption into American society. This is a model that I call the transformative model of citizenship. It held that Native Americans had to transform in order to earn US citizenship. Again, this was very much in line with the oppressive assimilationist regime that the United States was practicing at the time. But then here's a picture from the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act, which made all Native Americans within the territorial United States citizens, whether they wanted to be or not. Absent is the compulsory ceremony where Native Americans were expected to dress a certain way, where they were expected to give up arrows, where they were expected to take up farming, where they were expected to pledge allegiance to the president himself. The individuals who are standing here are from the Osage Nation, and they're standing next to Calvin Coolidge, and they are now citizens of the United States, regardless of their quote unquote habits. I argue that the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act operated under a different set of precepts than the Dawes Act. And I call this the natural citizenship model, that Native Americans were intrinsically American citizens, regardless of their history, culture, religion, etc. And moreover, they had a right to their histories, cultures, religions, unmolested by American forces. And I argue that this change that you can see in front of you was really due to Native activism. And that's where peyote comes in. 6 years before members of the Osage Nation stood with the nation's presidents, other members of that nation were filing petitions with the House and Senate committees of Indian Affairs. In 1918, there was a national fight over the legal status of peyote, which is a sacred and central component to the Peyote religion, which was practiced by many in the Osage Nation. Indigenous people in Mesoamerica had used peyote, which is a low-growing cactus, as medicine and religious sacrament for thousands of years. And by the 19th century, Native Americans in Texas and Oklahoma had also adopted the religious practice and established a set of rituals forming the peyote ceremony. Peyote followers believe puts practitioners into direct contact with God. So leading peyoteist Reuben Snake, who passed away in the 90s, he said, quote, "If Jesus was God incarnate in human form, our holy peyote is God incarnate in plant form," unquote. In the 19th and 20th century, assimilationists found the religion and use of peyote threatening. They published sensational articles about all-night orgies, all-consuming addiction, and frequent ceremonial deaths. They held that this quote-unquote absurd cult was a bastardization of Christianity and a distraction from their civilizing quote-unquote mission. So this all culminated with a bill that was meant to outlaw the use of peyote in 1918. And it goes before a subcommittee of the House and Senate Indian committees. And it receives a lot of publicity in 1918. And this, I argue, is a really, really great case study into looking at the transformation of transformational citizenship policies into natural citizenship policies. There is no clear-cut winner here, and that's why I think it's so interesting. You can see the players wavering. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about how people who supported and did not support the use of peyote mobilized this language of transformational citizenship. So the first person that I'm going to talk about is Chester Arthur, who was from Montana. And he believes that the use of peyote was distracting from the pursuit of citizenship by Native Americans. He held that Native Americans should be citizens of the United States, but that peyote was detracting from that. He said, quote, "In this day and time when government is making every effort to civilize and educate the Indians, the effect of this drug is undermining the work of civilizing them and educating them, is bringing them back to their old superstitious beliefs," unquote. This was seconded and echoed by Gertrude Bonin, who you can see here. She was a Yankton individual, and she actually said that because the Indian needs his rational mind to meet his fond hope for full citizenship, unquote, peyote should be outlawed. So again, she's using this idea that peyote stops the transformation, that it's a distraction, that people who were on this transformational journey would be shepherded off of it. And then what she would do further in this, before the subcommittee, would say, American citizens, you who are already citizens, please, we ask you to support this legislation so that we may too become citizens. But people who did not want peyote to be legal were not the only people who use this language of transformational citizenship. So I have a picture here of Francis LaFleche, who is an Omaha individual, and he testifies that actually peyote makes Native Americans, quote unquote, better citizens. He wrote, quote, "For a number of years, a deplorable state of drunkenness prevailed among the Omaha, during which time assaults, abuses of women and children, even murder were rampant, so that it became dangerous for people to be on the roads at night on account of drunk men," unquote. But then he credits the turning around of that situation to peyote. And he says, quote, "It revives my hope that the Omaha will yet become sober and useful citizens," unquote. And he is questioned directly by a representative about this, who asked him, "Do you contend that the use of peyote makes them better citizens and more truthful?" And he says, without hesitation, "I do." So again, you can see how peyote is being used on both sides of this debate. But then there's another side of this as I wrap up, which is about natural citizenship. So in this fight, Native Americans would come to the subcommittee and they would say, look, we're not making this about what makes us better citizenship, what makes us better citizens. We are saying that we have an intrinsic right to our religion and to our cultures. So Jock B. Bear, who is an Arapaho Indian chief, says, quote, "We do not think Congress should pass any law to prohibit peyote religion of the Indian race, to destroy that religion, as we feel that we are guaranteed freedom of religious worship under the Constitution of the United States." And this was echoed by members of the Osage Indian Nation who wrote to Charles Carter, who you can see pictured here. And they say, "We understand that the Constitution of the United States provides that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. God is truth. Religion is one's belief as to what truth is, and we all hold certain opinions and all working for the same goal, notwithstanding the fact that there are many views of this subject." And so what you can see here is that Native Americans would use the language of peyote being their God-given right, and that the United States had no jurisdiction to infringe upon their religious convictions. And so I'm happy to report that in 1918, this bill actually fails. And you can see these type of debates get circulated as Congress worked towards the production of the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act. And I think that's my time.
All right, thank you, Lila. And again, during the session, feel free to type the questions out in the comments as everybody's presenting. It shouldn't be too distracting to them. I'll copy them down and I'll get to them at the end, or we all will get to them at the end of the session. Bob Beach,
Hey.
it is your time.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us. Look forward to an interesting conversation after the presentations. So passage of the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937 was pushed as part of a federal government initiative to standardize state narcotics laws, which itself was an effort on the part of U.S. diplomats to assert themselves as global narcotic control leaders during the first few decades of the 20th century. U.S. officials were able to make the case that controlling its domestic supply of drugs was the key to achieving international cooperation on opium production and distribution. First came the Harrison Act, then amid Prohibition, which occurred in a much different context, but was along the same lines, the Uniform State Narcotics Laws, and then the MTA, the Marijuana Tax Act. And in this way, the Marijuana Tax Act was an outgrowth of U.S. efforts to control heroin. Adding cannabis to the list actually complicated things. It wasn't a particularly popular drug of use, but it could be found growing pretty much everywhere. Now, to make the case that cannabis was even worth controlling with federal government resources, Federal Bureau of Narcotics Chief Harry Anslinger had to reinvigorate the rhetoric rooted in decades of problematic racist tropes about the drug's effects, a campaign we've come to refer to as Reefer Madness. The topic generated thousands of printed pages, many of which Anslinger authored personally in academic, professional, trade, and popular press, informing citizens about a drug that few in the United States had much knowledge about, let alone bothered to use. Now, the sheer amount of press generated during the 1930s has led to vast over-assumptions about the extent and nature of cannabis use during this period. Historians, starting in the 1970s, have complicated and nuanced these policy assumptions, breaking with the so-called Anslinger paradigm and adding intellectual, cultural, and social histories into the mix. But what remains is the ever-elusive analysis of the people in the United States who regularly or semi-regularly smoked marijuana during this period. And this older history is much harder to get to. David Courtwright's co-authored 1982 Oral History Addicts Who Survived includes a few firsthand accounts of marijuana use during this period, but the book's focus on heroin obscures the extent of users' cannabis use. Sporadic evidence does occasionally pop up from users in the archives, often as handwritten notes to officials, but these tend to be much more inquisitive than confessional. So what does exist to speak to this user experience are the stories that users tell filtered through institutional lenses. Now, for most of my larger project, I rely on the Federal Bureau of Narcotics records alongside published periodicals and newspapers. Now, the existing historiography suggests that cannabis was indeed a minor drug of use during the 1930s. But by focusing on what sort of details do emerge in the existing sources, we can find some of the foundations of the ever-growing market for cannabis, which after more than a century has evolved into a borderline respectable recreational drug today. It's no mistake that we're here presenting in the AHA on April 20th. I pick up the story in the 1920s, as a major opioid epidemic arose amid the controversy over opioid maintenance following passage of the Harrison Act. It was also the start of national prohibition, which banned the manufacture, distribution, and sale of alcohol, making alcohol harder to get, especially among poor working class folks. Now, for people interested in regular drug use, heroin was where it's at. To the quote unquote wet middle class were speakeasy, medicinal, and privately stocked alcohol. And so while cannabis was hardly a drug of choice among illicit drug users, it was an option, perhaps for those unable to access other means of psychoactivity. Now, my dissertation project attempts to fully flesh out the various ways that individuals use marijuana during this period, from so-called recreational use as self-help medicinal treatment, and to a certain extent in pop culture, film, radio, literature, and comic books. But today, I'm going to focus on the productive labor involved in growing, preparing, packaging, and or selling the banned substance. And I argue that during the 1930s, marijuana became a niche market for small-scale operations, providing a mild psychoactive drug to the market and generating family revenue. Finding evidence of this economic activity remains limited and problematic. FBN records are useful, but federal level arrests pale in comparison to state and county level arrests. And those official records are much harder to come by. So most of the evidence from my presentation today comes from newspapers, though to the extent possible, they'll be more fully supported in the final work. And so reading against the sensationalism of newspaper reporting on marijuana during this time can reveal some surprising things, including some of the labor requirements involved in the trade, which I'll list in a minute. The three major types of marijuana stories that dominated newspaper coverage in the 1930s, and as I've mentioned, a result of the press generated during the Reefer Madness era, leading to overstatements about the overall use of the drug. Headline articles revolve mostly around major arrests for one, but they also included sensational crimes either associated with or merely blamed on marijuana, and pronouncements from law enforcement and community leaders highlighting the dangers of the ongoing marijuana menace. All three of these categories, and the last two especially, were, as Isaac Campos has suggested, heavily influenced by deeply flawed knowledge about the origins and ostensibly indigenous use of the plant. And as such, stories were polluted with suggestions of assassins, insanity, and death. With the aid of full text searching, which picks up articles buried under other headlines, articles that are part of local bulletins, and those with nondescript titles, and the expansion of the number of papers available on these platforms revealing other localities, the more mundane and decidedly non-sensational lived experience of regular cannabis users comes into clearer view. Found in articles about local dope rings broken up in smaller cities, and among the court reports of individuals standing trial for local violations of cannabis statutes, we find people, usually implied poor, working class, itinerant, or migrant laborers. Among these folk, we find relationships with cannabis that don't fit the mold of these more sensational stories. Instead, we see poor working folks making do in surprisingly similar ways. So as an overview, several patterns emerge that, while possible to exaggerate or overstate in newspaper reports, seems to suggest a relatively standard operating procedure that is consistent across the sort of wide geographical span in which these activities took place. Plants were found growing among crops, usually between rows of corn. Harvested plants were being dried, usually found hanging on the premises. Processing the plant into sellable form required packaging, typically using an inventory of empty tobacco cans or tins, often found either full or ready for market or empty during raids. Packaging also included pre-rolling cigarettes, which required labor often provided by people living on the property. Federal agents' forms, for example, from the 1930s, as well as newspaper reports, would document either the number of plants, the number of packed tins, or the number of rolled cigarettes in addition to weight, all of which reflect this labor system. Now, to give just a few examples here from the limited record. In September 1932 in California, 6 people were arrested after, quote, a ranch devoted to the raising of marijuana, unquote, was found. Anton Garcia, his wife Rita, and the couple's 14-year-old daughter Consuelo were arrested. A patch of the plant was found ready for harvest, and they found 6 cans of marijuana on the property. In August 1933, at the home of Miguel and Marie Peralta near Oakland, a garden was found surrounded by board fences 10 feet high, behind which marijuana plants were growing between rows of corn. In Longmont, Colorado in November, Francis, Lawrence, and Asa Palma were given suspended sentences pending deportation after a patch was found at their home growing in the middle of an alfalfa field, valued at just over $7,200. The plant was being sold, processed as individual cigarettes for 5 cents each, and a tobacco can full for $1. Now, as Reefer Madness ramped up through the mid-1930s, attention focused on these cases, and the number of examples increases from 1934 to 1939 through the immediate post-MTA period before dropping off steeply after 1940. Now, these stories reflect the complex of household labor involved, often including children, even in makeshift residential situations. For example, in New Jersey, in the June of 1934, Jack Bell, who was traveling from Atlantic City and boarding at the home of a Mrs. Graves, discovered the plant growing in the neighborhood, which he claimed could be sold to cure head colds. According to a neighbor who thought the plants were mint, Bell proceeded to, quote, gather a quantity of the leaves from these plants and dry them in an oven in the home of Mrs. Graves, intending on making cigarettes out of them. Now, Bell was arrested after selling 40 of the 140 cigarettes, the last few to local police, that had been rolled by Mrs. Graves and her 2 daughters. In Buffalo, New York, in October 1935, Margaret Ritchie and her 2 children, Moses and May, were arrested after a raid on the home at 113 Iroquois Alley. During the summer of that year, police had seized a large amount of the weed from the same property and arrested Margaret and a man called Raymond Gonzalez, though Margaret was spared after Gonzalez took full responsibility for the operation. It was clear that by the second arrest, Margaret was running the show, and in the follow-up raid, Margaret and her children were arrested with 600 cigarettes and a quantity which was discovered hanging up for drying. Now, these sorts of operations generated a rigorous market at times, suggesting that while not lucrative by any means, investment of the time and effort was worth the trouble and worth protecting. A major raid in March at the Richmond, California home of Gabriel and Rita Nunez uncovered 49 tobacco tins, 29 of them market ready. Arrested with the couple was Rita's son, Magdaleno Ramirez, and their granddaughter, Lucy. And when police arrived, Rita, quote, ran back to the yard to a shed where she climbed to a table and was removing tins of marijuana from a shelf when police overtook her. Now, it was suggested in the article that the Nunez home supplied the entire Richmond area with each tin selling for $2.50 a piece. Now, following passage of the Marijuana Tax Act, attention continued to focus on these sorts of local operations, like that of Carmen and Mercedes Saldana of Afton, Wisconsin. In September of 1938, a former school teacher who had purchased cigarettes from the Saldanas but claimed to never have smoked them, arranged a purchase using marked bills provided by the Racine County Sheriff. The ensuing raid yielded 30 pounds of the weed at a, quote, drying and curing plant in a home near the railroad tracks. Now, while Carmen was found not guilty at trial, Mercedes pled guilty to possession and was sentenced to 3 months in jail. Now, a pair of 12-month sentences were given to Jose and son Jesse Bravo in Merced, California, after officers found 75 pounds ready for market in their car, along with, quote, numerous growing plants mingled with the growing corn and other crops on the place. In a bedroom, quote, packing paraphernalia, including 65 empty cans, were also found. Now, after 1940, these types of stories stopped appearing in newspaper reports. The war in Europe certainly commanded a great deal of attention, and in the context of the war on drugs, concerns over cannabis lost the urgency of the 1930s. In the ensuing decades, attitudes toward cannabis would change from a drug that caused violence to one that caused heroin addiction. In this new context, cannabis, somewhat ironically, became much more criminalized. And the risks associated with conducting cannabis operations became much more associated with organized cross-border smuggling operations and increasingly militarized for protection domestic production. Eradication campaigns guaranteed that even surreptitious crops were becoming targets for removal. And the needs for heightened security drew the supply of the drug away from these smaller, perhaps family units, toward more organized concerns. But some of the family productive units entered this new wave, and by way of my final example, starting in 1939, a long-distance, high-volume operation developed between producers at a small farm in Chaffee, Missouri, and users in New York City, and possibly other cities like Detroit and Chicago. The farm, owned by Robert and Alda Williams, was regularly sending trunks of processed marijuana to Robert's sister, Laura Rilo, reportedly the ring's business manager, who was responsible, with the assistance of another sister, Virginia Williams, for distribution to street-level peddlers in Harlem. In 1944, a chest went unclaimed, and after the railroad company auctioned the chest to a buyer who discovered the marijuana and reported it to police, the Williams clan was rounded up in February of 1945, eventually pleading guilty and serving 1 to 3 year terms. Now, this research, to wrap up, attempts to fill in gaps in historical discussions of cannabis, but also within the context of gender and labor. In Elaine Carey's 2014 book, Women Drug Traffickers, she focuses on the role of women in smuggling drugs, mostly heroin or cocaine, across national borders, largely within the context of these larger organized networks. My work also draws on Mary Murphy's 1994 article on Prohibition in Butte, Montana. Both of these works highlight the role of labor and economic opportunity in otherwise illicit activities, empowering women to capitalize on those opportunities. And my work adds working families and the marijuana trade to that analysis. My argument that marijuana production and sale was a productive choice for families dealing with poverty and uneven employment during a period of major economic, social, and political upheaval during the 1930s. In 2021, when we're continuing the process of reconciling with our troubling history of marijuana control, for example, with New York's recent legalization legislation, which includes record expungement and reinvestment in affected communities. We would do well to think about the longer history of these destructive policies, seeing how in the early 20th century, the origins of these policies are deeply rooted, deeply connected to the activities of a handful of small level producers, some of them operating as family units, making do, and shifted, and the increased criminalization shifted production to heavily capitalized, potentially violent and extra legal production and distribution networks. Thank you very much.
All right, Bob, thank you. Next up, we have Dr. Moretta. Go ahead when you're ready.
John, you're muted. Hi, John. You're muted.
There we go. How's that?
Yes.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Anyway, oh my Lord. Anyway, I was just going to compliment Lila and Bob on their presentations, because part of my presentation will also include a little bit of discussion of peyote. And as Bob strongly intimated, the concern when people that he was speaking about were minorities. Me, part of the current drug problem is it's become racialized, which I will allude to in a minute. But my primary focus is going to be on the 1960s counterculture, and they're making a reality. Both Lila and Bob had kind of intimated was that there's always been a kind of subterranean drug culture in certain communities in the United States. The hippie movement is going to become legitimate and thus more alarming because it's white. Anyway, there's little doubt that one of the hippies' most profound legacies, creation and legitimization among 1960s youth of the use of mind-altering drugs, find the bliss hippies longed for, but believed unattainable in straight society. Any one of the manifestations of the hippies' alternative way of being came to define the movement, it was the drug culture they propagated. Indeed, dope usage and the counterculture became symbiotic, the hippies' psychic staff of life. In the assessment of one Time magazine reporter, there was one sure way to distinguish a real hippie from his assorted sympathizers. Hippies drop acid. Chemical is a central theme to their way of life. Psychedelic drugs of various sorts always paved the way to hippie. By the late 1960s, the hallucinogenic drugs, marijuana to LSD, appeared to have so engulfed the counterculture that even today, when most people think of 1960s hippies, stereotypically see a long-haired, truly scented, shabbily garbed guy meditating cross-legged in a psychedelically painted room, a marijuana joint dangling from his lips, Jefferson's airplane, White Rabbit blaring. To hippies, though, drugs and dope are two distinct entities. Drugs encompass substances that are both good and bad, ranging from Valium to codeine to marijuana and heroin. Particularly bad drugs to hippies were amphetamines, especially speed or methadone, opiates, heroin, morphine, and opium, and cocaine. They were all considered to be downers because they did not expand perception. Hippies also viewed alcohol as a drug, not only because it was addicting, but also because it was the establishment's most popular high. In effect, hippies opposed addictive drugs, such as alcohol, largely because they made the user stupid rather than expanding consciousness. Hippies embraced drug usage, marijuana, peyote, psilocybin, hashish, mescaline, and even banana peels, because those substances led to a higher realm of sensory awareness and helped free the individual from hangups and the repressions of conventional society. For many hippies, the liberation of the senses via dope use became the raison d'etre of their movement. However, as the decade progressed, drug usage did not remain exclusively hippie identification for very long. dope penetrated mainstream white suburbia more rapidly than anyone anticipated, linking the comparatively small hip counterculture with the vast majority of straight youth, many of whom became as enamored of acid and marijuana as their hippie counterparts. Not all hippies, even straight youth who smoked dope or took acid, ascribed metaphorical importance to their activities. They simply enjoyed the momentary high or the kick the drugs gave and looked forward to the next pleasurable turn-on. Nonetheless, for many, dropping acid or smoking a joint became the rites of a secret society in which the proper set and setting was essential to the experience taking place behind drawn shades. Windows open, incense and candles burning, towels wedged under the door jamb to avoid detection, rock cranked up full volume. Standard drop back to the event. Grass more than LSD to one hippie opened up a new space for middle-class white kids, an inner space as well as an outer space. It became a ritual, sitting around with your friends, passing a joint from person to person, listening to music, eating, talking, joking, maybe making out, all the senses heightened. In 1966, LSD became a big story when Congress outlawed it. Possession and distribution were criminalized. National and local authorities overwhelmingly agreed that LSD use was dangerous to both individuals and to society. The majority of Americans agreed, dismissing LSD messiahs such as Timothy Leary's notions of its consciousness expanding values as delusional. Outcome not worth the risk. Newsweek, Life, Saturday Evening Post all did features on the drug's history, effects of increasingly widespread use. Prompting the media coverage were doctors' reports of LSD-induced psychiatric breakdowns. Time reported in 1966, the disease is striking in beachside beatnik pads in the dormitories of expensive prep schools. Notice the word disease. It has grown into an alarming problem at UCLA and the UC Berkeley and the UC campus of Berkeley. No one can even guess how many more self-styled acid heads there are among oddball cult groups. The Food and Drug Administration further stoked the media blitz by briefing reporters on the increasing number of bad trips they've been told about. The LSD had become an epidemic, familiar word, especially among American youth. According to psychologist Stanley Cohen, we have seen something which in a way is most alarming, more alarming than death in a way. And that is the loss of all cultural values, the loss of feeling or of right and wrong, of good and bad. These people lead a valueless life without motivation, without ambition. They are decultured, lost to society, lost to themselves. The 1960s progressed and drug usage accelerated in popularity. So did the public outcry, the demand for the law to crack down on the alleged drug epidemic sweeping the nation, turning American youth into hopelessly self-destructive delinquents and drug addicts. However, as Time magazine observed, pop drugs hardly portend anything as drastic as a new and debauched American spirit, as some alarmists might believe. That a joint today did not signify a junkie tomorrow. Rather, the increase of drugs reflected a persistent unwillingness of youth to accept the straight world, as well as the social and political dislocations of the times, uncertain wars, a capricious draft system, inequitable distribution of opportunity and income, and institutions too immured against necessary change. Nonetheless, morally outraged parents and authorities condemned the drug culture, wanted to bring the full force of the law down upon even the most casual or recreational user, many of whom were arrested and sentenced to long prison terms, especially in the counterculture's early years. Such a heavy-handed dragnet prompted even some government officials to publicly denounce the current laws as completely out of proportion to the dangers of the drugs. particularly marijuana. I'm sure to all of you, this sounds all too familiar right now. Director of the National Institute of Health, Dr. Stanley Yoles, there was no clear instance in which the punishment for an infraction of the law is more harmful than the crime. No doubt, countercultural advocacy of hallucinogenic drugs helped to open the door to the use of much harder drugs, as cocaine and heroin, to attain the same consciousness delivered by LSD or marijuana. Although cocaine and heroin use was not prevalent among the hippies, who largely preferred acid or grass. Most hippies condemned cocaine and heroin, but unfortunately, both drugs entered the hip scene via the more dissipated characters who simply added two more alternative substances the hippies could use to get high. In the process, many hippies found heroin or cocaine a better kick than marijuana or LSD, became addicts, abandoned their use of psychoactive dope, and became lost, bereft souls to the visionary world of psychedelia. Hip permissiveness relative to drug use allowed hard drugs to penetrate the hip community, which contributed to hip's destruction as well as the problems elsewhere. However, smack and crack use did not become popular or chic until the late 1970s and into the 1980s among the decades post-hippie hipsters who were born toward the end of the baby boom or even later. Having missed the 60s, they sought a high that had little to do with opening any doors of perception. Set and setting for these hipsters became the bathroom stall of the clubs they frequented. Demand for those substances in the beginning of the 1970s and forward engendered a series of government war on drug campaigns that have largely been overall failures in virtually every capacity, other than continued incarceration for users who became mostly African Americans in the last several decades. Beginning with the Nixon administration and going forward. Indeed, the drug war, like so many other attempts to restore normalcy in this country for white people, has been racialized. Not only has that been the result, but the attempt to build walls, supposedly to keep the drugs and cartels from south of the border out of the United States, has only caused the increased violence along the U.S.-Mexican border, the vicious and murderous drug wars among competing cartels. Not surprisingly, on this issue, hippies would have argued that legalization would strip the drug lords of their enormous drug trade profit, as well as end much of the violence spawned by drugs, which is the result of rivalry among sellers, not youth. The current opioid epidemic, which unlike the supposed drug epidemic of the 1960s, is more real, serious, and potentially causing more death than the current police shootings of African American citizens. The opioid crisis is only alarming because it is white, such as that the 1960s hippie drug problem. The majority of those kids were obviously white. Is white and not a people of color crisis, which, if it was, would not even be on the official radar. Not only is it overwhelmingly white, but mostly among those impoverished white folk of rural America, who have perhaps endured generational cycles of poverty. To escape their despair, to ameliorate the psychic pain of marginalization and disfranchisement, they turn to painkillers. And once again, as in the 50s and early 60s, prescribed healthcare officials. Oxycontin, Norco, and a variety of other drugs have truly become the opiate of the masses. It is much easier to distract one from the despair of poverty and hopelessness by giving them drugs, rather than attempting to address the real issues of their existence. Moreover, as always, it has been far too profitable for drug companies who would lose huge sums of money if the epidemic was effectively addressed. I'll close with this, the perennial question that many of my students always ask. Did the 1960 drug culture create this current drug problem? Yes and no. No doubt the 1960s saw the birth of the US as a drug culture. It was a culture that ebbed and flowed. It was cyclical, youth-oriented, and driven. Nonetheless, Americans became a drug people of plenty. Affluence allowed more citizens access to many more palliative forms of pain relief. There is a pill for virtually anything that causes us discomfort or pain, whether physical or emotional. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Moretta. All right, and last to present will be myself. This is an abridged paper that I on my website for. This is an abridged paper for that's posted on my website. For those that are interested, I'll be sending out the link in a couple of days whenever we get the YouTube link for the session. So for millennia, people have used drugs for recreational, medicinal, and religious purposes, but only within the last 200 years has a new purpose emerged, which is using drugs for inspiration. While this panel is meant to explore drug use in 20th century America, my paper heavily involves 19th century Europe. This is because in his 1995 book, Night, English poet and essayist Alfred Alvarez traces the emergence of opium as the source of artistic inspiration for the Romantic era. Since the positive effects of the drug include an immediate sense of euphoria and numbness, soon followed by severe drowsiness, it is no coincidence that the narcotic became popular at a time when writers were obsessed with dreams and nightmares. These writers believed that the dream world provided new experiences and new places that they could incorporate into their work. Thomas de Quincy, perhaps the most outspoken opium addict of the era, first popularized the drug in his book, Confessions of an English Opium Eater. De Quincy believed that inspiration could transcend from the dream world into reality, and he wrote in his journal that if a man could throw paradise in a dream and have a flower presented to him as a pledge that his soul had really been there, and found that flower in his hand when he awoke, aye. In 1804, Friedrich Turner identified morphine as opium's most active ingredient, and with the arrival of the hypodermic syringe in the mid-19th century, injecting morphine became the most popular ingestion method. It is impossible to quantify the popularity of opium, especially as soldiers began returning home from the Franco-Prussian War in the early 1870s, but the drug was especially prevalent among artists and writers of Bohemian Paris. And opium became a perfect substance for rebelling against bourgeoisie, as the drug causes users to become isolated and withdrawn in their thought, often making it physically impossible to contribute to conversation or productivity of any sort. Opium use also provided a sense of camaraderie among Bohemian users who fashioned themselves as fighting against traditional literary, art, and social norms. But what may have begun as rebellion had another side effect. The dream world and the deranged senses provided users with fodder for their art. Having relied for decades on a humorously terrible translation of the Confessions of an English Opium Eater, France got its first decent translation in 1860 by Charles Baudelaire. Combining his own essays about drug use with summaries and analyses of the Confessions and Suspiria de Profundis, a collection of De Quincy essays viewed as a sequel to the Confessions, Baudelaire published the book Artificial Paradise. Baudelaire, however, is most remembered for his poetry, and in his poem, The Double Room, concisely explained the rooms that Bohemian users escaped and entered when under the influence of opium. He described the first room as an impoverished apartment with filthy living conditions, occupied by a writer whose mental state is filled with too many regrets and anxieties to complete his manuscript. However, after opiate intoxication, the apartment is transformed into a room of warmth, beauty, and elegance. Baudelaire seems here to be referencing opium as an escapist agent. By the late 19th century, a new method of opium ingestion drastically increased the drug's popularity in France. Imported from Asia by soldiers returning home from French Indochina, smokable opium called shandu quickly became the favored method. Opium's effects may have always been dreamlike, but the earlier ingestion techniques were always utilitarian and ugly. Through the ritualization of smoking shandu, opium gained even more mystique and grew in popularity. By 1901, Paris housed up to 1,200 opium smoking establishments known as fumes. These opium dens became frequent haunts of writers and artists. In describing the appeal of a 19th century Parisian fume, psychologist Justin Burge has explained that with its refined rituals, its mysterious alchemy, its lacquer, its silk, and its jade, with its dimmed light and the drug's odors, the fume offered the writer and the poet an incomparably more dense matter. This transition to the act of smoking opium also cannot be overlooked. When you take most medicines appropriately, either oral or intravenous ingestion is most common. Thus, smoking opium removed the plausibility that its use was strictly medicinal. Fernand Olivier, a model for Pablo Picasso, who became his lover for nearly 8 years, wrote in her diary of a night she smoked opium with the artist, saying, "In spite of having an upset stomach and oppressive headache afterwards, which kept me in bed the next day, I couldn't wait to start again so as to achieve that spiritual intensity and sharpening of intellectual awareness that one experiences under the influence of this drug. Everything seems beautiful, bright, and good." In Olivier, we see opium not being used because it was taboo or as a means of escapism, but because she believed it heightened her senses. This is a distinguishable difference separating those of mainstream society who used the drug to be in vogue versus bohemians who used the drug to sharpen their senses and to inspire creativity. French historian Gerald Siegel marks the end of Paris's Bohemian era at 1930. Within 30 years, another drug-fueled counterculture would emerge thousands of miles away in California, who were the beatniks. There are several parallels between the Parisian Bohemians and the post-war American beats and the later hippies they would inspire, but the most obvious of these were the centrality of ardent hedonism, the desire to drop out of middle-class society, and the group's sense of camaraderie brought about through taboo drug use. Another striking parallel is the importance of the book to the culture of each group. Just as De Quincy's Confessions of an English Opium Eater spurred opium's popularity among Bohemians, Aldous Huxley's The Doors to Perception, published in 1954 about his recent mescaline experiences, were largely responsible for the popularity of the drug of choice during the 60s, psychedelics. Huxley took the title of his book from William Blake's quote, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite." This line captured Huxley's belief, soon adopted by the post-war countercultures, that psychedelics had the potential to provide innumerable ways to interpret and explain the world around them. 6 years after the publication of The Doors to Perception, two psychologists from Harvard University, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, began the Harvard Psilocybin Project. The project was shut down within 2 years, and Harvard eventually fired both professors for the ethical violation of participating in drug sessions with the project subject and for pressuring grad students to take the drug. After losing their jobs, Leary and Alpert continued taking trips to that garden and promoted psychedelics as a tool for spiritual enlightenment. They believed the drug could remove societal programming and thus reveal people's base self. While Leary and Alpert experimented on the East Coast, psychedelics were being used more self-indulgently out west. In 1964, Ken Kesey, newly famous for his novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, took an LSD-fueled road trip across the United States to promote his next book. He and his cohort, dubbed the Merry Pranksters, traveled from California to New York in a colorfully painted bus called Further. Along the way, the Merry Pranksters distributed LSD to the masses, causing the reputation of Kesey and this little-known drug to rise. Tom Wolfe documented the events wonderfully in his book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. In one scene, Kesey watched a crawling baby and, referencing Huxley, described his interpretation of the child's mindset, saying, "That baby sees the world with completeness that you and I will never know again. His doors of perception have not yet been closed. He still sees the world as it really is, while we sit here left with only a dim historical version of it manufactured for us." While Leary, Alpert, and Kesey advocated psychedelic drug use to keep open the doors to perception, the beat poets and writers transitioned into a new community, the hippies. The lines of distinction between psychedelic drug use for hedonistic or for creative purposes were often blurred for the hippies, but these two categories of use were certainly not mutually exclusive. As Eastern and Native American religions grew in popularity among the hippies, some of which the rites included the ingestion of hallucinogens, these drugs gained an additional religious and spiritual aspect. For example, poet-musician Jim Morrison often made references to Native American culture in his writings and described himself as a shaman. Shaman is someone who interacts with the spirit world via an altered state of consciousness. Morrison believed his drug and shaman experiences influenced his writing, thus combining psychedelics with spirituality for creative purposes. Morrison famously said in an interview that he believed in a long, prolonged derangement of the senses in order to obtain the unknown. It was Morrison who had earlier suggested to his bandmates that they pay homage to Aldous Huxley and William Blake when naming their band, The Doors. And this trend of artists, musicians, and writers using drugs for inspiration has yet to end. And thinking about drug use among artists over the last 200 years, a key question emerges. Do drugs actually cause artistic inspiration? The Romantics, Bohemians, the Beats, and the Hippies, despite the disparate set and setting of their drug use, all certainly believed that drugs influenced their creations for the better. And there are many theories, from the scientific to the metaphysical, to address this question, but they all largely fall within two categories: deconditioning and escapism. The book Imagination defines deconditioning as the act of taking LSD and becoming like a child again, shedding off the straitjacket of adult middle-class programming and making it anew, an idea closely associated with the cleansing of the doors of perception interpretation. For example, we are taught from a young age that a blade of grass is green because it contains chlorophyll, which absorbs every color except green, and thus it reflects the color green. However, for people who are deconditioned from educational programming, grass can become green for any number of chosen mystical reasons. Zooming out from a single blade of grass, the world at large can become filled with limitless explanations for those who are chemically deconditioned. Perhaps artists and writers who already possess creative minds are the best equipped to ponder and communicate these extra possibilities. And although this is the most popular with the general public, many neurologists and many psychologists and neurologists challenge the deconditioning explanation. Neuroscientist Heidi Malwad, for example, argues that the process of writing or creating art is so mentally taxing, especially while working on a deadline, that dissociating from reality is merely a method of escapism that allows users to temporarily forget the demands of the real world and to return replenished. Since opium causes users to fall into a deep sleep, Malwad's explanation might particularly help to explain the inspiration achieved by the Parisian Bohemians. In addition, many Bohemians and later hippies opted to drop out of their comfortable middle-class home in favor of voluntary poverty. They would live in cramped, small, or dirty apartments in crowded or crime-ridden neighborhoods, and perhaps users in both eras might have desired to detach from these conditions, as described in Baudelaire's Double Room poem. And whether or not drugs can actually increase creativity and provide artistic inspiration is still largely disputed, but there does indeed seem to be a connection, especially in the minds of many users. Whether this connection results from drugs offering users a way to deprogram or by providing a method of mental escape is still unknown. But perhaps the two are not antithetical to each other. And that is it for my paper. All right, can I get the co-host to rejoin? All right. I've got a couple of questions that I can go ahead and ask, but please, as this goes on, feel free to type out more questions. We have one here from Sophia. She said, just curious if anyone knows how the US government was aware of Vietnam soldiers' need for drug rehab centers upon their return home. How did the soldiers become addicted to drugs, probably stronger than pot who supplied, or was it morphine addiction, but fought drugs? Thanks.
Add to that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Cole.
I was going to say, you and I are probably best.
Yeah.
I've got an answer. You have one too.
Yeah, well, I'm of that era. I'm a vet, so maybe a little firsthand insight. No, the government was aware of the increasing drug problem Vietnam, but not until the late 60s, early 70s. There really wasn't much of a drug problem at all at the height of the war, ironically, 566 into 67. As defeat became more imminent, as soldiers became frustrated, then you saw the increase among usage. The government was fully aware of the problem, but really didn't know what to do about it, didn't know how to treat it, and wanted to ignore it. It would all go away as part of a nascent post-traumatic stress syndrome that would, like any veterans of previous wars, when they came home, would be all fine again. That was not the case. And you got to also remember that many of the combatants, right, particularly white combatants, many of them were ex-counterculture who had been drafted. They had no exemptions. In my outfit, I had several of those guys. So they were already, accustomed drug use. So they got to Vietnam, was like, hey, this is even better here. We have easier access. And like in any stressful situation, it's a way to relieve that stress. I was an officer. I turned a blind eye half the time. There was the guys in my outfit using it. Should I have? Probably not, but I did. Which is probably in the long run not very morally responsible of me. Do I hold myself responsible as a consequence for those guys coming home being worse drug addicts? Maybe, but no. These are issues I wrestle with. The short answer to what the question was, yes, the government was very aware, but simply did not know how to effectively deal with it, which to this day, I'm sure they regret. Go ahead.
That's a much better response than I had. There was a study that was done in mid 70s, I think 1975, 1976, where they sort of addressed this question that basically the government knew that troops were in stressful situations and that they were returning home and they weren't necessarily seen as the heroes that they had seen in 1945. They were challenged when they got home. So that added an additional layer of stress to it as well. I mean, they came back with injuries. They had seen their friends die. And this coincided with the relaxation of sort of the taboo of drug use. It became more accepted to use drugs. This also coincided with drugs becoming cheaper because the supply was so available. So it just made sense for soldiers to use drugs when they got back.
Agree.
All right, another question is from Kyle Jackson, who also complimented my shirt. Thank you, Kyle. This is for Bob. He says that, a lot of the propaganda and the criminalization of cannabis in the 30s was bound up with racism toward Black and Mexican American communities who were perceived or portrayed as being the primary users of the drug. Does the evidence support any sort of conclusions about the actual demographics or regional distribution of cannabis users?
Good question. Oh, Bob's on there.
Yes, that was my fault that time. So yeah, that's a good question. It's kind of hard to say, specifically in terms of the stuff that I presented today, and in terms of like newspaper reports. Newspapers will occasionally mention race when they're talking about individuals, but it's not consistent enough to be reliable. And then by extension, sort of making assumptions based on last names is like a really problematic way to determine that kind of information. Another fact that kind of complicates this kind of analysis is that the specific arrests as reported seem to indicate, as you suggest, Black or Mexican users being the primary users. But as we know, these are based in sort of racist assumptions of policing, right? That led police to focus on those kinds of communities, right? My guess, though, in thinking about what I've got so far, and sort of thinking about like kind of the answer to this question, it seems like it's more a question of class than race in terms of like actual demographics. Again, because cannabis is a relatively light drug of use around the time that I'm studying anyway, compared to other options that were available. It seemed like cannabis users were kind of relegated to the sort of lower class among the illicit drug users of the time, right? So it wasn't necessarily a dignified thing to be a marijuana user as opposed to a heroin user, right? In terms of those specific communities. And so, yes, it seems that class is a more accurate marker of who's sort of more likely to use, somebody who is excluded from access to alcohol or access to heroin. And the other kind of category that I find interesting that I'm really working on trying to think about in my dissertation are young children, right? Not necessarily poor children either, but children that also don't have access to alcohol or other quote unquote hard drugs that might be able to find some of these drugs being sold by some of these folks. So I don't know if that answers your question entirely, but yes, the racist assumptions not only kind of influence the way we thought about those drugs at the time, but also influence the kind of evidence that's available for us to analyze in the present.
All right. And we have the next question is for Lila. What role do historians have in modern issues of drug abuse in indigenous communities?
Great. So I'm gonna answer a different question first, which is what roles do historians have in modern issues of peyote use? And I would say that, which is separate from drug abuse, but with peyote, historians really, I think, can serve indigenous communities by affirming its historical use and as a central part of the religious ceremony. Separate from that, thinking about modern issues of drug abuse in indigenous communities, one way that historians can help is provide the context. So what is the historical context that have created drug abuse in indigenous communities? So whether that be, examples of imperialistic practices that the United States has inflicted upon indigenous communities, or whether that be the creation of legislation that has deemed certain drug use illegal. So I think context and looking at the historical roots of these communities is really important.
All right, thank you. The next question. I'm not sure who the question is for. Comes from Christopher. Hey, Christopher. But it's what percentage of narcotics prohibition was due to the departments in the U.S. government as opposed to other forces in the private sector? For example, competitors of hemp or religious groups. Does anybody have a response to that?
I guess maybe I could sort of speak to it a little bit. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, one of the problems with cannabis control was the fact that due to the sort of long-running hemp industry in the United States and the ease with which cannabis can just sort of flower and spread kind of willy-nilly, leads to, yes, a lot of the, again, focus on the extant problem in the 1930s involves referencing this largely wild, not specifically cultivated places where cannabis is growing, right? As opposed to, as I discussed in my presentation, the more kind of carefully, and it's unclear how carefully, but the more carefully cultivated plants that are growing, between corn rows, right? It sort of referred to often in the early 20th century as the roadside weed, that can literally be found anywhere. And so, yes, I think that there's something to be said about the importance of that older hemp industry, which by the 1930s is kind of phasing out or phased out, in kind of hyping up the concern over cannabis in the 1930s. But it's unclear and perhaps unlikely that a lot of smokers are actually getting their supplies from these roadside patches. That's kind of all I have. I don't know if anyone wanted to add to that.
I've got nothing.
It's good.
All right. The next, Bob again. Are you able to speak about the illicit production of cannabis? For example, the Midwestern farmers during the Great Depression? Did the pickup know how on their own? And were they connected to the traffic?
Yeah, that's kind of as a jump off from the previous question, right? One of the things that does happen kind of at the turn of the 20th century, kind of through the 30s, is an effort by botanists and other kind of scientists to analyze kind of growth patterns and interventions that can be done with various what they called economic plants, cannabis or hemp actually being one of them. And so in terms of know-how, you've got a number of government publications, agricultural bulletins that give hemp farmers advice on how to farm hemp in sort of best practices. And then you also have that information sort of backed by what you might call like agricultural research that kind of blooms in the 1920s. And at least in terms of hemp, it's again in response to competitive farming products that are kind of pushing out the extant hemp market in an effort to kind of revive in a failed way the hemp industry.
Cole, you're mute.
Thank you, Lana. Yeah, so I believe that was all the questions. I'm going to check one last time. Now's also a good time. If you do have a last minute question, go ahead and send it.
I mean, I think it's cool. We have a little bit of time. If folks want to just maybe jump, I mean, there's not that many people in the room. If folks want to just jump on, unmute themselves and ask a question, I think that they could do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not all.
Few more seconds. What were you gonna say, Bob?
I'm just saying, not all at once.
All right.
Hey, I was going to ask Bob, how's it going, Bob? It's been a while.
Good, Aaron. How are you?
Pretty good. I just defended also. So yeah, look out for however many years it takes to turn it into a book. Anyway, yeah, I was just curious. This is kind of like a general question, I guess, but if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on, I don't know, how were these Mexican laborers like using cannabis, and maybe whatever you might be able to say about how they became like maybe the networks and how they were connected to other consumer populations, or if you got any sense of like how they were transporting it. Yeah, and I know that stuff's really tough to find from, newspaper articles that are just about people getting arrested for smoking dope or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there are kind of examples of, I guess to answer the second part of the question is, there are examples of, and I think Elaine Carey talks a little bit more about sort of the cross-border transportation of drugs in that context, right? And especially kind of after the period that I'm looking at, kind of the post-war moment, a lot of that drug trafficking, a lot of those networks are in much more organized circles, right? Prior to that, yeah, it's kind of difficult to kind of establish these longer longer distance networks. And I think a lot of it is based on kind of overstatement by news reports. A lot of these family units are being described as like marijuana rings, and it doesn't seem like they're operating in quite the same way as like an organized crime outfit might organize a distribution ring. To the first part of the question, in terms of use, it's a little bit more difficult, perhaps, to think about use patterns, particularly with Mexican users. But it does seem that there is, maybe this is a sort of preview for future discussions here, but there is some suggestion in one particular example is of all of the arguments being made largely by defendants in courtrooms that they're using the drug for health reasons, for asthma, for coughs, for pain, whatever else. And then there's also kind of that, again, it's hidden and implicit in the newspaper articles. But a lot of the raids are occurring in what we would have called T-pads, right? Places where the drug is being used. And there is some evidence, some solid evidence to suggest that those kinds of networks existed. And again, they were probably sort of locally based, neighborhood based kinds of networks. And I don't know if that answers your question at all.
Yeah, I came across, I mean, it's actually amazing how many parallels there are between some of the stuff that you're finding with like the small scale kind of laboring growers and consumers. And just for context for everybody else, before this turns into just a private conversation, my work is on the history of cannabis ganja in the Caribbean in connection to indentured workers and plantation laborers from India.
Yeah.
And I found also like a lot of people giving kind of medical reasons when they were on trial. And it's like hard to know, I think, and they did have medical uses, but it's hard to know how trustworthy that is too, because of course they're going to give a medical use because it's more likely that they'll get like a lighter fine or that they'll get off or whatever. So that I found a similarly really tricky, it was a tricky interpretive kind of thing there. And I have like a remarkably similar view too in that context of its use as a commodity among these like subaltern laboring populations. In these times of like economic hardship, like, and in my case, the 1880s in the Caribbean, and the late 20s and the 1930s, when of course this global Great Depression is happening, sort of similar time frame here. Yeah. And I found a very similar kind of thing where it's like largely being cultivated by laboring people because it's a lot more profitable than, just growing corn or whatever in your case, or being like a sugar laborer in my case. Anyway, we'll have to talk about this more off the air so we don't like take over the talk, but thanks everybody for indulging.
Yes, the other thing that's interesting about that is I think it was Vera Rubin, right, in the 70s, had that big conference where she sort of elaborates this kind of difference between the ganja complex, which was more sort of applicable in places like Jamaica, and the so-called marijuana complex, which she argued was sort of exclusive to the United States. But I'm finding that there is significant evidence of that sort of what you might have called at the time the ganja complex actually in the United States as well.
Oh my God, we're gonna have to definitely talk about that because I have a chapter where I get into like ganja coming into New York, and I have some arguments connected actually to LaGuardia's study. And so we're going to have to touch base on this because, oh man, this is going to be awesome because I need to incorporate some of this in my book. And if any way I can help you too, I would be happy to, because I found some cool stuff about like smugglers from Jamaica. Anyway, this is really good to hear. Sorry, it's exciting. It's like, I mean, we're going to think forever, and I'm kind of want to put it aside in a way, but I'm like, oh man, you're getting me back into it. Okay. Yes. I'll shut up now and quiet my mic here.
Thank you, Aaron.
All right. Any more questions? Any last questions? Put it in the chat, or feel free to hop in, unmute your mic. All right. Then if there are no more questions, we will conclude the session. Thank you all for joining us today. Again, I will email all of the attendees once the video is uploaded to YouTube, and I will also attach a PDF of our papers to that email. And we look forward to continuing this discussion with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
It was great. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right.